Ever wish you had like a magic 8 ball for suppliers? Like shake it up and bam, perfect supplier every time.
Right. Wouldn't that be nice?
Well, today's deep dive is probably the next best thing because we are diving deep into supplier management with SAP S/4HANA.
And we're not just talking about like the basics here, like placing orders and hoping for the best. This is about using data to actually build those strong supplier relationships. The kind that can really make or break your business.
Totally. It's about being strategic, right? Because a good supplier isn't just someone who gets you the stuff you need. It's like they become a part of your team almost.
100%. And to really understand how SAP S/4HANA can help make that happen, we're taking a deep dive into Chapter 12 of this book, all about the system. It's all about supplier management.
Pages 529 to 555 to be exact. So bookmark that one, folks. It's a must-read, apparently.
Seriously, it's full of great stuff. One of the first things that jumped out at me was how much it emphasized the why of supplier management.
Because it's not just about like checking boxes and making sure things arrive on time, right? There's a bigger picture.
Exactly. It's about strategy. And the book actually uses this really interesting example, McDonald's.
Okay, love it. Everyone understands McDonald's.
Right. And when you think about it, they're not just, flipping burgers. They're maintaining this globally recognized brand.
Yeah.
I mean, every Big Mac has to taste exactly the same, whether you're in New York or London or Tokyo.
No pressure, right. So how does a company that huge make sure everything is that consistent across their entire supply chain?
Well, the book talks about how much McDonald's invests in building super strong relationships with their suppliers. Like they literally collaborate on everything from developing new menu items to making sure the quality is up to par.
It's a true partnership, not just a transaction.
Exactly.
It's not just about like finding the absolute cheapest ingredients. It's about finding suppliers who get it, who understand the McDonald's brand.
Exactly. Who share their values and their vision. Now, obviously not every business is McDonald's, right?
Definitely not.
Some companies are going to be more focused on just getting the best deal, especially if they're dealing with like basic commodities where it's easy to switch suppliers.
Right.
But the thing is, even then, supplier management is still important.
Of course. Even if you don't need a long-term strategic partnership, you still need a way to find good suppliers, get the best prices, and make sure everything runs smoothly.
Exactly. And that's where SAP S/4HANA comes in. Because it's not just like a digital filing cabinet for your supplier info. It's more like a tool that actually helps you make smarter decisions about who you do business with.
Okay, so less about just doing the thing and more about using data to figure out the best way to do the thing.
Yes. And the book really breaks it down into these three main functions. You got classification, segmentation, and evaluation.
So it's like you're creating a profile for each of your suppliers, but way more detailed and useful than anything you could put together on your own.
Exactly. Think of it this way. SAP S/4HANA uses this system of purchasing categories. It's how they group the materials you buy and the suppliers you're buying them from.
So instead of just organizing by department or product type, it's more nuanced. You're getting to the heart of those supplier relationships.
Exactly. For example, let's say your company's really big on sustainability.
Which, let's be real, who isn't these days?
So with S/4HANA, you could have a specific purchasing category just for, say, eco-friendly office supplies.
That's smart, because then if you're looking for a new supplier, you don't have to waste time digging through websites and emailing back and forth trying to figure out who meets your criteria.
Exactly. It's all right there in the system. And the best part is that it's all connected to your procurement processes, so you can streamline everything.
That's amazing. Okay, so now you've got all your suppliers neatly organized, but how do you actually evaluate how they're doing?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. Supplier evaluation in S/4HANA goes way beyond those basic metrics like on-time delivery.
Because that's important, but it's not the whole picture, right?
Exactly. And the book really emphasizes this. S/4HANA lets you look at the hard data, like delivery times and pricing, but also the subjective stuff.
The stuff that's harder to measure, like are they easy to work with? Do they communicate well?
Yes. And one of the best features, in my opinion, is the questionnaires. You can send your suppliers these custom questionnaires right through the system.
Wait, seriously. So I could send a supplier a quick survey asking them about like their sustainability practices or even things like their labor standards.
Exactly. And it's not just for show. It's not just like checking a box. All that data you collect actually gets factored into this super comprehensive supplier scorecard.
Okay, now I need to hear more about these scorecards. How do they actually work?
It's basically a blend of the hard data pulled from your transactions, and that subjective feedback from the questionnaires.
So it's literally like a report card, but for your suppliers.
Pretty much. And the book talks about all these different evaluation apps that feed into this scorecard. Like there's one that shows you how accurately a supplier is fulfilling your orders, and there's another one that specifically looks at delivery punctuality.
Which is huge if your whole production process relies on getting those materials exactly when you need them.
Exactly. And because all of that data is in one place in the system, you can actually start to spot trends and patterns. It helps you make those really informed decisions about which suppliers are the best fit for your needs.
It really is like having that crystal ball. But instead of vague predictions, it's cold, hard data.
Exactly. Although the book does make a really good point about the whole data thing. It's that it's not enough to just collect data. You have to make sure you have enough data to actually draw any meaningful conclusions.
Right, because one late delivery or one person's opinion, that doesn't necessarily mean the supplier is terrible.
Exactly. In fact, the book even recommends having at least 35 responses to those supplier questionnaires to make sure you're getting statistically relevant results.
So even though S4HANA gives you the tools to automate all this data collection, you still need to be smart about how you're using it.
Absolutely. You still need to do your due diligence.
Speaking of due diligence, the book does mention some setup and configuration that's required to get all these cool evaluation tools up and running. What's involved there?
It's honestly not as complicated as it sounds. The book does a good job of walking you through the important parts. One of the big ones is setting up what they call number ranges for your different evaluation criteria.
Okay, so if we're talking about on-time delivery, we'd need to define what on-time actually means in this context.
Exactly. Are we talking about within the hour, within the day? You're basically setting the parameters for how the system measures everything.
Makes sense.
And you also need to define what file types suppliers can upload if you're asking for supporting documentation.
So no one's sending you a 20 gigabyte video file as proof of delivery.
Right. It's all about keeping things organized. And then another thing is you get to define qualification levels for suppliers.
Oh, interesting. So I can have my gold star suppliers, my silver star suppliers.
Exactly. It's just a nice visual way to quickly see who's consistently meeting your expectations and who might need a little extra help.
I like it. It's very structured, very data-driven. But I also want to make sure that we don't forget about the human side of things.
Oh, for sure. And the book does say that relationships still really matter, even with all of this amazing technology we have now.
Because at the end of the day, we're all human, right?
Exactly. You can't automate everything. You still need those strong relationships to really succeed.
Which actually brings us to another interesting point that the book touches on. What happens when you're dealing with suppliers who maybe aren't as, let's say, technologically advanced as you are?
Ah, yes. The multi-ERP dilemma.
Yeah.
That's something that a lot of companies struggle with.
Because if you're using something as advanced as SAP S/4HANA, but your supplier is still using, something a little outdated.
It can be a nightmare trying to get everyone on the same page.
It's like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole.
Pretty much.
But the book does hint at a possible solution to this, right?
It does. They mentioned something called central procurement, which is basically this idea of having one system that can kind of orchestrate everything across multiple ERPs.
So instead of having to log into 10 different systems to manage all your supplier, you would have one central hub.
Exactly. And here's the really interesting part. The book suggests that this central procurement system could potentially integrate with SAP Ariba.
Which, as we talked about earlier, is a whole other beast when it comes to things like supplier discovery and onboarding.
Right. So even if your supplier data is scattered all over the place, there's still hope for getting to this beautifully unified, streamlined approach.
That's good to know. Okay, but before we go too far down that rabbit hole, let's talk about those suppliers who maybe aren't quite as plugged in as some of the others. The book talks about how great S/4HANA is for managing suppliers who are already in the system and everything. But what about the ones who aren't?
That's a really good point, because not every supplier is going to be at the same level technology-wise.
Exactly. And it's you can't expect them all to just completely overhaul their systems just because you're using SAP.
Especially if they're a smaller company, or maybe they're in a totally different industry with different standards.
Totally. So it's not always realistic to think that everyone's going to be on the exact same page.
And I think that's what makes this whole central procurement idea so interesting. If they can really make it work, if you can actually bridge the gap between all these different systems, that could be huge for supplier collaboration.
It would be revolutionary, almost like creating this universal language that everyone in the procurement world can understand.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Imagine if you could just share data with any supplier without even thinking about what systems they're using. No more workarounds, no more manually entering data.
Time you'd save. Okay, so maybe that perfect world is still a ways off, but it's good to know the possibility is there.
For sure. And I think the biggest takeaway here is that supplier management is changing fast. It's not just about getting the best price anymore or making sure your deliveries are on time. It's bigger than that. It's about building those really strong strategic partnerships that benefit everyone involved.
And SAP S/4HANA, with its focus on data and streamlined processes, it's giving companies the tools they need to actually do that.
It's a whole new world for procurement.
It really is. Well, that about wraps up our deep dive into supplier management with SAP S/4HANA.
This was a good one.
I know, right? We covered so much. Everything from building those strong supplier relationships to all the cool tools S/4HANA has for things like classification, segmentation, those scorecards.
We even got into some pretty next level stuff with central procurement.
I hope everyone listening has a better understanding of just how much SAP is changing the game when it comes to procurement.
And if you really want to go deep, that book we were talking about is definitely worth checking out.
Until next time, happy procuring, everyone.